Before we get started, I do need to say that we will be discussing some sensitive topics on this episode. So if you're around children or if certain topics make you uncomfortable, I would suggest that you skip this episode. The love stories of the person we're reflecting on this week is a legendary musician known for his soulful and inspiring music. While his music has captured the hearts of millions, possibly even billions, his love life has also been a topic of interest amongst many fans, and nosy folks too. He's been married 3 times and has a total of 9 children. Now, despite some rocky moments that have occurred in his personal life, he continues to give us incredible music that speaks to the soul and inspires listeners all across the world. Ooh. Hey, let me put you on speakerphone. I just called to say we're talking about Stevie Wonder. You liked that, didn't you? And hey, shout out to all the new owl runners that are watching or listening. Hey boo, hey. Since many of you are new in the pews, let me tell you, I'll Tell You What is a weekly podcast that shares the weddings, marriages, and romances of Black figures throughout time. We bask on these relationships not to be messy, but to remind you of the passion in our past and to humanize people we put on pedestals. Basically, it's all love. Black history. And I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that tells you these stories every Monday. Welcome to the 12th episode of I'll Tell You What. So I truly believe that the relationships we witness growing up between our parents or guardians will impact the ones we have in the future, romantic and otherwise. And since last week I told you about Marvin Gaye's upbringing, I feel that it's only necessary to try to include these details for more context before we reflect on these love stories. Now, with that being said, let me tell you about the parents of Stevie Wonder, Lula Hardaway and Calvin Judkins. When these two met, Lula Mae was already the mother of a son named Milton from a previous relationship to a man named Paul Hardaway. She had been kicked out of her aunt and uncle's home for having a child out of wedlock and moved her and her son into the home of another relative. Now, Calvin was a hustler, an older guy nearing his 50s, and they fell in love or something like that. But by mid-1949, Lula had another son, Calvin Jr. Afterwards, they eloped and Calvin attempted to get an honest job. That did not last long. Calvin was so hungry for a quick buck that he would do almost anything for it. Stuff you couldn't even imagine. Like, he tried his hand at being a PIMP. Yeah. And his S-worker was his wife, Lula. He didn't necessarily introduce her to this new business opportunity in a way that you would hope your spouse would. But, like, granted, one is not expecting their spouse to make this type of life change, nor include you in it. But basically, the fact that he came home once with a Dijon and he snatched her arm and was like, hey, Lula, go take a ride with him. And you know exactly what I mean. It wasn't really a ride. But anyway, it was just absolutely ridiculous. This would begin, obviously, an extremely toxic marriage where he would rent out his wife for a few dollars, and Lula didn't feel like she could do anything about it initially. She would justify it by, quote, invoking some twisted construction of love, but also probably because she just felt helpless. Calvin was not only sledding her out, he was knocking her out as well. One time, he threw her through a table after slapping her because she refused to buy him cigarettes. Through the years, Lula would learn to fight back, and in that instance, she slashed him with the knife she carried on her, which made him run out the apartment like a wounded animal. Months after delivering their son Calvin, by the end of 1949, she'd be pregnant again with their son Stevlin. She had a very, very rough pregnancy where she delivered him prematurely. Now, he was in the incubator for almost 2 months, which became the reason why he lost his sight. Because if you didn't know, Stevie Wonder wasn't actually born blind, but at the time, preemies were known to have retinopathy of prematurity. This is basically where there's like a lot of oxygen in the incubators that that can create a, quote, an irregular growth of blood vessels in the eye, which could lead to scarring, cataracts, or retinal detachment. Now, Lula felt very protective of all of her sons, but more specifically her youngest, and told Calvin they all need to just move out of Saginaw and go to Detroit to give not only them, but their kids a chance at a better life. They did, but this didn't make Calvin any better of a husband or a father. That man essentially became a deadbeat, allegedly, and even on one occasion took a young Stevie to his apartment by himself and left him there. Now, the lack of responsibility from Calvin made Lula only work harder to take care of her kids. She would take on extra hours as Stevie got older because his brothers could then help watching over him, and this was likely around the time that he was introduced to girls, kissing, and everything beyond that. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is probably a 15 or 16-year-old Stevie, right? No, not at all. Stevie recalled a moment when he was 8 years old, of the third grade variety, when he was fooling around with a girl based off something he learned from a Red Fox album. Now, it wouldn't stop there. Teenage girls, too, would be interested in Stevie, despite his obvious impairment in age. He couldn't get enough of the companionship, and that would be a recurring theme throughout his life. By the time Stevie was 12, his mother had long divorced his father and got back with his brother Milton's dad, Paul. He had another kid before their reunion, and after Lula and Paul got married, they had another child, Renee. Calvin, Stevie's dad, would fade into the abyss mostly, and Stevie at this time was a young Motown artist and felt somewhat foreign in his own home. Now, Lula would try to punish him and set boundaries and standards, but as her son got older and gained more independence outside of his home, it got a little bit harder. At that time, some of his extended guardians were technically like Berry Gordy and some of the other staff assigned to him for Motown. Now, that's not to say he didn't love nor respect his mom. He definitely did. But at that time, you gotta think about it. She had a young legend in the making on her hands. So essentially, that's the childhood Stevie grew up in. Perhaps this will give you a little bit more understanding into the romances he experienced throughout his life. In the late 1960s, after entertaining a lot of chérie amours, Stevie Wonder started to date another Motown artist named Sarita Wright. Now, Sarita was born in Pittsburgh and she moved to Detroit with her family when she was a teenager. When she connected with Stevie, she was speculated to be the replacement of Diana Ross in the Supremes. While Stevie was always known for flirting or dating some girl, he really fell for Sarita. They found a common love in writing songs and would do so for many, many years. Sarita is even attributed with rekindling that interest in songwriting in Stevie. For instance, many don't know that one of his classics, Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours, was actually one they collaborated on together. And that song has longevity. I mean, like over 35 years later, it would be the anthem for then Senator Barack Obama in his campaign for presidency. Now, by 1970, the news broke that Stevie Wonder was engaged, this time for real. And I'm saying that because about a year or so before, Stevie was allegedly dating the lead from The Flirtations, this woman named Ernestine Pierce. He told the news that they wanted to get married, but many assumed it was all just a prank on the press. Now, what wasn't a prank is what actually happened on September 14th, 1979. That day, Stevie and Sarita got married. Now, the day didn't go off perfectly as the ceremony was delayed. Apparently, Stevie's nose was bleeding for almost an hour, and he came out of the bathroom with a piece of toilet paper stuffed up his nose as the ceremony proceeded. But almost a decade later, he'd actually tell Ebony magazine that he had cold feet, so he went to go get some wine with his cousin John. Now, I don't know if both of these events occurred or if the bloody nose was just a way to cover up the wine run, but either way, Sarita looked gorgeous. The wedding ceremony was officiated by Reverend J.A. Caldwell and took place at Burnett Baptist Church in Detroit. The reception took place at a Hawaiian restaurant. They had about 300 guests, including some of the Gordy siblings, as this reception was paid for by Motown. Now, they apparently would serenade each other in these impromptu performances throughout the night. And regarding the wedding food, because I know y'all want to know, all I could find out was that they had pineapple chicken and a very large wedding cake that Stevie helped cut, and they went on to honeymoon in Bermuda. When they got back, they moved into a 3-bedroom ranch where he saw the wedding gift from his boss, Berry Gordy, a $5,000 Moog synthesizer. This was the latest and greatest toy for musicians at the time. Now, Berry was likely trying to stay in Stevie's good graces because he knew that in a few months, the following May to be precise, his contract was going to expire because he would be turning 21. Now, shortly into their marriage, Sarita learned how lonely and sad Stevie was, something he didn't want to burden the rest of the world with. This was probably because for the first time in his life, he wasn't living at home. Despite being so busy and barely available to even just be at home when he still lived there, he probably more than likely also wanted to have some level of adult autonomy. But he probably couldn't think of how to necessarily have that without living at home. So possibly getting married was the solution. Some would even speculate that they didn't get married out of true love, but more of convenience for Stevie. Now, we have to remember at this time, Stevie was a baby adult. He was 20. He would cope with his loneliness more so when he was on the road, though. He'd frequently have a plethora of girls around and on him. So much so that it was sometimes surprised that other folks that worked with him, you see, because they wanted Stevie to be this little pure, innocent little boy, like little Stevie Wonder, right? That was the image in his earlier years. So to find out that he was outside and had the girls on him, that was not the brand of Stevie that they was trying to push. So needless to say, the romantic love between Stevie and Sarita was drying out. In the early 1970s, most of the folks at Motown started to head west, including Sarita. Motown was setting up a new headquarters in Los Angeles as Detroit wasn't a viable place for the growth of the company anymore. Stevie, however, had no interest in moving to California. Upset with the lack of respect and compensation that he received from Motown, despite all that he had done for their artists, including himself, he let his contract expire after he turned 21. He thought he was going to get like $3.4 million from them and ended up getting like $100,000. He was like, absolutely not, I'm gone. So he would move to New York and work on some independent projects before essentially just returning back to Motown. So by the time he dropped Music of My Mind, which was his first album back at Motown when he had this really, really good contract, the marriage between Stevie and Sarita was basically unofficially over. And with that being said, a new woman would actually take the main role in his heart almost immediately. In 1972, as Stevie Wonder's marriage to his wife, Sarita Wright, was becoming more and more estranged, he met a woman named Yolanda Simmons. Now, he went to the office of an attorney, Johann Vigoda, because he wanted to officially make the duo behind Tonto's expanding headband, Malcolm Cecil and Robert Margouleff, a part of his production and publishing companies once he actually got them off the ground. Yolanda was the secretary at the law firm and gave Stevie some incentive to keep coming back. Now, flirting at work was just the start for these two, and it didn't take much time for them to start going together because by the end of the year, they were actually shacking up. Now, as this relationship was blossoming, his marriage was officially coming to an end. The following year, as two mature adults would, Stevie and Sarita decided to get a divorce. Honestly, at that point, they were barely together anymore. They both conceded that they would remain friends and love each other, but their marriage no longer served either one of them. So I'm not sure if you could tell, but Stevie was actually a pretty friendly guy. Not only did he maintain an amicable relationship with his ex-wife, but other women too. I mean, after his divorce to Sarita, Stevie would produce her debut self-titled album. He also wrote several of the songs on the album too. Allegedly, Motown didn't push it as hard as it could have, so it wasn't that successful, but it's written that Stevie was so determined to help Sarita become a star. And while he dated Yolanda, he also had a part-time lover, an anonymous woman named Coco, who was Stevie's, quote, most constant companion since his divorce, according to the 1973 Rolling Stone cover story. Now, one of Stevie's assistants would assume Coco's time with Stevie was brief. Now, the following year in October 1974, Jet magazine announced that Stevie Wonder was engaged to Yolanda. The date of the wedding was never disclosed, nor were any other details, and nor would Stevie's team even confirm anything. Now, did he propose to Yolanda because he wanted to get married again, or did he propose because he wanted to ease her nerves and show a symbol of commitment? Girl, I don't know. But what I do know is that by the end of 1974, Margalef and Cecil were like, we do not care for Yolanda. They felt like she was sort of like a vulture of sorts. Margalef said that he felt some of the people in Stevie's circle, including her, would, quote, isolate him from the very things that made him good. Now, the sentiment of others didn't matter too much because in late 1974, Yolanda was pregnant with Stevie's first child. On April 7, 1975, they had a daughter named Aisha Zakia. Her name is Swahili for strength and intelligence. Now that he had created a family, he started to put roots down on both coasts. In California, he bought a 10-acre home in Hollywood Hills, which was really close to where his mom lived. But in New York, Yolanda and Aisha resided in his 4-story townhome in the Upper East Side. He got a nanny for Aisha and provided stability for Yolanda by hiring her as his bookkeeper and also paid for her to pursue her dream and attend fashion design school. Now, life was good for Stevie. Around this time, he would make $13 million within the next 7 years at Motown, plus a 20% royalty rate and more control over singles. And he was so in love with his daughter that while working on perhaps one of his best albums, Songs in the Key of Life, he wrote, "Isn't she lovely?" And no, contrary to popular belief, Aisha is not the baby that is cooing on the song. Now, despite all of this, eventually, Yolanda had to come to terms with the fact that Stevie was never going to marry her. Now, the reason for that was heavily speculated, but actually never confirmed. You could probably assume what some of those potential reasons were, but one that particularly stood out to me was that some assumed that despite how his first run of marriage ended, Sarita was the one that got away. We'll never know. Now, maybe the reason was revealed when Songs in the Key of Life was released. And the liner notes of the album, he wrote a dedication to Yolanda that said, quote, "You have given me more than I ever knew existed." Very, very sweet, right? But also he wrote, "My mind must be polygamous and my spirit is married to many and my love belongs to all." And then he would list out several women's names, including Sarita and Coco. And then there was this blank space for the person reading these liner notes to write their name in as well. Though completely unheard of during that time, polygamy and polyamory were likely not things that Black women were signing themselves up for or could fully understand. However, when you've invested so much time and love with someone, it's either continue to stay or start all over. That's just what I'm assuming. I truly don't know. But either way, Yolanda stayed and their family grew some more. Right after the album dropped and the first single, I Wish, was on airwaves, Yolanda had their first son, a little boy named Keita Sawandi Morris, which meant worshiper and founder. But a few years after that, by the early 1980s, Yolanda couldn't do this anymore. And I suppose she felt like with 2 children and over a decade of life together for what, just to be his girlfriend? I just said Black women and women in general aren't really grasping or wanting polyamorous lifestyles for themselves. The words in his song Lately might have spoken to the feelings that he had. Look it up. Yolanda would move to New Jersey with their children, and by 1982, they would officially end their relationship, and he would say that they would remain good friends. But you know, Stevie wouldn't be alone for long. After a decade with the mother of his 2 children, Yolanda Simmons, Stevie Wonder would go through many relationships throughout the next 2 decades. Now you're probably wondering, how is Stevie knocking all these women off their feet? Perhaps it was his charm, his talent, or his, quote, extraordinary sensory skills. Now Stevie wasn't attracted to just any old body. All the women he dated and romanced were attractive. He knew this too. And I know what you're thinking. No. It's not that. According to this interview with Jet magazine, he will learn that a woman was beautiful not by looking at her, obviously, but by, quote, listening to her talk. Jet magazine wrote, "As she expresses herself, Stevie can feel her vibrations and her personality." And he would say that he listens to her inner beauty. One in particular that had said inner beauty was his girlfriend from the early 1980s, Melody McCauley. They began to date after his relationship to Yolanda ended. And in 1983, she gave birth to their son, Mumtaz. And you know what? Melody would actually call herself Melody Macaulay Morris, though Stevie's sentiments around marriage had not changed. So, needless to say, their relationship ended at some point in either the late 1980s or early 1990s. And let me tell you, there are two things I learned in doing the research for this week. Number one, Stevie was extremely private, so much so that the mothers of his kids, Sophia and Kwame, have never been revealed. And number two, even biographers get their information wrong, because there were so many things I was like, actually, no. As his relationship to Melody came to an end, he started dating a singer named Kimberly Brewer for a few years. And then he lived with his girlfriend, Angela McAfee, his wardrobe assistant. And that relationship was from like 1996 to about 2000. And after Angela, he fell for a fashion designer named Karen Millard, or better known as Kai Milla. At the time, she was a divorced mother of one, a son named Miles. Now by 2001, Stevie experienced many milestones for his family. I guess he changed his mind because he married Kai in the early part of the year, and then he would go on to adopt her son Miles, and then later Kai would give birth to their son Kylan, which is a portmanteau of his parents' names. Now right after the birth of Kylan, mess would arise. Stevie's ex Angela, from about like a year or so before, filed a palimony suit. And if you didn't know, because I definitely didn't, palimony is, quote, compensation paid by one member of an unmarried couple to the other after separation. Angela wanted $30 million because she said Stevie didn't satisfy the verbal agreement they made when they were still together. She said he tried getting at her for over a decade and, quote, ultimately persuaded her in August 1996 to quit working as a wardrobe consultant and move into his Los Angeles estate, according to the LA Times. She said Stevie told her that, quote, God told him that Angela was his wife. You know, I really don't have the time to get into how triggering that phrase is. If you know, you know. But because of that, she should quit her job and be the homemaker while he'd be the breadwinner and the sole provider of the home. And throughout their relationship, she said that she helped with making the interior decor of his home more accessible, helped maintain his weight, among other things. And she also said that they agreed that if they broke up, he'd pay for her lifestyle, clothes, round-the-clock security, insurance, etc. And she also claimed that he gave her the herp, but neglected to tell her that he was infected. Now, Stevie's lawyer would counter and say she stole over $150,000 from him and that, quote, since he doesn't have herpes, one can only wonder where she contracted the disease. Oof. With no real resolution, as the judge probably saw this as a she said, he said, they ultimately ended up settling out of court. Now, years later, Stevie would be struck with a series of bad news. In 2004, both his brother Larry and ex-wife Sarita were stricken with cancer and would pass away. The death of Sarita had him in disbelief and I'm sure hurt him more than anyone could imagine. But happier days would be ahead because on Stevie's 55th birthday, Kai gave birth to another little boy, Manluk Carl. I hope I pronounced that right. The names were actually suggested by Nelson Mandela, but the mourning would actually return the following year when Stevie's mom, Lula May, passed away. Now, if you thought the death of Sarita had him down bad, the death of his mom and the fact that he wasn't able to get there before she passed away devastated him. Oh, I can't imagine. Now, he would learn of the endlessness of grief which bends and conforms to life in their absence. He would continue focusing on his craft while also being a doting father and a supportive husband. Stevie would be seen with their sons at various events with Kai, including her fashion shows. But sadly, their marriage would lead towards their separation in October 2009, and Stevie filed for divorce in July 2012. But as I've mentioned plenty of times before, love would never be far away from Stevie. As Stevie was going through a divorce to his second wife, Kai Millard, he began to date his current wife, Tamika Robin Bracey, in 2012. Now, I don't know how they met, but according to some articles, she was previously married and had 3 kids, one of which was a toddler that sadly passed away in May 2005, not too long after Mother's Day. The child fell out of a window and actually wasn't the first child to do so at that residential community, allegedly. As one would imagine, that level of loss must have been extremely hard, but she would find love again with Stevie. As I mentioned, they started to date in 2012, and between that time and the end of 2014, they would have 2 kids. Now, you might have remembered the rumors around that time because they were saying that they were expecting triplets. Like, oh my gosh, Stevie's about to have 11 children. Like, calm down, people. I don't know how they got that, but this was all over the place. And Stevie would go on The View in November 2014 and set the record straight. Like, no, we're actually having a little girl and she's due like in a month. So anyway, by the following October and over 3 years later, his divorce to wife Kai was finalized. They agreed to joint custody of their sons, and Stevie was to pay her $25,000 a month in child support. They would remain amicable, as Stevie rarely left a relationship on a bad note. On the other hand, life with Tamika was good because by spring of 2017, the news began to circulate that they were engaged and their wedding was approaching. The details shared about the wedding was that it would be a dusty in Jamaica on June 17th in front of guests like Elton John, and they also signed a prenup. But that wedding, nah, child, that's not actually how it went down. And you know what? Some celebrities are intentionally elusive with details like this, or they'll say one thing and do another. Part of that is for their own privacy and safety, and sometimes it's just because details change and NDAs are sent out, and I don't know. Now, I want you to know, the girl up the street, she can't make all these changes because she's already trying her hardest to get the 163 people she's invited to this wedding to RSVP on time. But the wedding stresses that you and I might have had aren't necessarily the stressors that they have because they are in a whole different tax bracket. But regardless, Stevie and Tamika did get married in July 2017 in Los Angeles, not Jamaica. Their wedding took place at the Hotel Bel Air. Stevie was 67 at the time and Tamika was 42. We know very little about this wedding because, again, I'm sure those NDAs were tight. But what we do know is partially due to one of the background singers posting to her Instagram before making her page private. And of course, some of the news outlets picked it up because I'm pretty sure she was tagging folks and hashtagging Stevie Wonder's wedding. Come on! You literally had one job, sis. These are the details we know because of her. They had hundreds of butterflies that were released during the ceremony. His children were the wedding party members. And apparently, no one had to question, isn't she lovely? Because Tamika looked beautiful in her form-fitted gown and headpiece. Babyface sang Whip Appeal during the reception, John Legend and Usher performed as well, and Stevie serenaded his bride. And I'm sorry, y'all, I couldn't find out what they ate. But as far as we know, Tamika and Stevie are still married as they were recently seen celebrating Stevie's daughter Sophia's birthday. Whew. Just last month. In addition to Sarita, his ex-girlfriend and mother of son Mumtaz, Melody passed away in 2020 due to COVID. And all runners, my good people, my friends, that concludes the many love stories of Stevie Wonder. If you want to know anything else, you want to know more about the details that I shared or some of the stuff I couldn't fit into this episode, I highly suggest you read the biography Signed, Sealed, Delivered: The Soulful Journey of Stevie Wonder by Mark Rabowski. There are many more articles and pieces that helped with this week's research, and the links to all of those will be included in the notes below. Now, you know how this part of the show goes. If you've made it this far into the episode, thank you. Please subscribe if you're not and follow us everywhere if you haven't done so already. If you enjoy listening to your podcast instead of watching, subscribe to I'll Tell You What wherever you listen. And please, leave a review. Now, a little bit of news. 1, we have hit some milestones this week, friends. Y'all, we hit 2,000 subscribers on the Tube of You. If you don't remember, we just hit 1,000 in July, like the beginning of July. So less than a month later, we've already hit 1,000 more. I love y'all, for real. Not only that, we've hit 1,000 followers on Instagram. So thank y'all for supporting and for showing love every single place that you can. I truly feel like it's only up from here. Now, the other piece of news is that we will be launching a Patreon account or something of that sort, hopefully before the holidays. I'm trying to just get some really good stuff locked in first before we launch that. So stay tuned. Of course, I'll continue to keep you posted along the way. But in the meantime, if you want to support I'll Tell You What, there are several ways you can do so. Head to I'llTell.com to buy some fun merch, including a shirt like this, or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/I'llTell and donate however much you desire or help chip away at something on our wish list. Now, all of these links are also included in the notes below. In addition to that, other things you can find in the notes below is where to contact me. If you want to email me, girl, go ahead. I am Isle@Hueido.com. That is AISLE@HUEIDO.com. Also, if you want to follow me, you can do so on social. And do you know that this episode is wrapping our Motown run for now? Yes, I know. We didn't get through everybody, and trust me, we are definitely going to run this back later because there's a lot more love to cover. But you'll never guess who we're going to discuss next week. Any guesses? See you in the pews.